Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Psychiatry Grand Rounds. My name is Tony Rothschild. I'm chair of the Grand Rounds Committee. Just a couple of announcements. In order to receive credit for attending today's Grand Rounds, one needs to fill out the SurveyMonkey evaluation, which came with the Grand Rounds announcement on Monday from Karen Lambert. Grand Rounds will be on Zoom for the rest of the academic year through June, but we are hoping and planning to be in person come September. If you have questions for today's speaker, please type them in the chat function and we will forward the questions to the speaker at the end of her talk. Next week's Grand Rounds on April 7th is the semi-annual Al Gruzinskis Lecture in memory of a former faculty member. The speaker is Christopher Slobogin, Hilton R. Underwood Chair in Law and Director of the Criminal Justice Program at Vanderbilt Law School. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. David Cochran, who's the Medical Director of the Center for Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disorders, CANDO, and Director of the Neurobehavioral Technologies Program at the Shriver. And today is the annual Shriver Lecture. Dr. Cochran.
Tony, yeah, it's great to be here and to be able to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sarabeth Border-Fingert. Sarabeth comes to us from within the Shriver Center. She is a pediatrician and implementation scientist who has really made a name in her career studying early diagnosis and treatment for autism spectrum disorder in children, as well as children with other developmental, behavioral, and mental health disorders. She is vice chair for clinical research in pediatrics and associate director for research at the Eunice Kennedy Shriver Center here at UMass. She's PI or co-investigator on multiple NIH-funded awards with primary focus on testing and evaluating implementation of interventions for autism. She's also an active mentor of other researchers, serving as mentor on multiple career development awards through NIH, as well as mentoring many pre and postdoctoral trainees. She's has published over 60 peer-reviewed manuscripts and also serves as an editor for the journal Autism and Hospital Pediatrics. And today she's going to be talking about her work looking at early diagnosis of autism and how structural racism is connected with some of the challenges there. So I'm very excited to hear what she has for us. And Dr. Border-Fingert.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. Apologies for the tech issues, but no surprise. We're all used to it by now. So I'm Sarabeth. As David mentioned, I'm Vice Chair for Clinical Research in Pediatrics, Associate Director for Research at the Shriver Center. And today I'm going to talk about a number of studies around early autism diagnosis, and particularly how structural racism interacts with early autism diagnosis and what we can do about it. Next slide. So I have no disclosures and I have funding from a number of agencies. Next slide. So first I'm going to talk about what is structural racism. Then I'm actually going to give you a little overview of autism. I know most people know what it is, so I'll keep that short. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean by early diagnosis and why we care about it, and then what we can do about it. Next slide. So I almost always start my talks in talking about language specifically, because it's really important to understand the difference between autism or person with autism and autistic. This comes up a lot in the spaces that I travel, so I just want to give a little overview background of that. And then I'm also going to talk about the difference between disparities and structural racism, because that also comes up quite a bit. Next slide. So this is my slide about autism versus autistic. And I think, you know, there's been an ongoing debate in the field for at least 10 years now about whether or not people like sort of person first or disorder first language. And over what I've witnessed over the years is that the language has moved, where many more people are preferring to be called autistic as opposed to a person with autism, but not everyone. And my strategy continues to be asking people what how they prefer to be called, and then trying to use the language of the person that you're directly interacting with. But these are just two quotes from some of my work that I think is important. So This is a mother who said, growing up, my son was mocked and teased as the, quote, autistic kid. I hate that word. Do not call my son autistic. And clearly this person had has a very negative association with autistic. But then this is another quote from someone who identifies as autistic. And she said, I am autistic. I am proud of that. It's not a disease that I caught. It is part of who I am. So this will come up a lot. And as I talk about different studies, I actually go back and forth in language depending on which study and which circumstance. But I just wanted to clarify that. And I'm happy to answer questions about it as well. Next slide. So again, there's disparities, which was sort of the traditional term for differences linked with social, economic, or environmental disadvantage. And that's very similar, but slightly different from structural racism. Structural racism, this is a definition I like that comes from, I think the CDC. Inequalities rooted in the system-wide operation of a society that excludes substantial numbers of members of particular groups from significant participation in major social institutions. So what I see as a difference is that one of them is more of an active word, that there are things that actively people are doing to that leads to exclusion, and disparities on the other hand is more of a passive word. And I actually think that that can be important. Next slide. So structural racism, this is a definition that I really like. What makes racism structural is the way it is interwoven in a series of linked, mutual reinforcing systems. So education, policing, banking, housing, employment, immigration, land use, elections, healthcare, and more. So what people will talk about a lot is that each of these structures has their own sort of history of racist principles, and that they interact with each other to create sort of the whole being worse than the sum of the parts. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk about autism. So I assume most of you know this, but autism is a developmental disability. This is also from the CDC's definition that can cause significant social, communication, or behavioral challenges. There's often nothing about how people with ASD look that sets them apart from other people, but people with ASD may communicate, interact, behave, and learn in ways that are different from most people. The learning, thinking, and problem-solving abilities of people with ASD can range from gifted to severely challenged. Some people with ASD need a lot of help in their daily lives, others need less. So that's why this is called a spectrum, because there's really a wide variety of presentations. Next slide. So that is a hyperlink. I don't know if this is going to work, but I was going to show a little video of a young child, a young autistic child. But if it doesn't work, we can skip it. I don't know if
it's not seeming to want to open.
Doesn't open. Okay, that's fine. You can go to the next slide. So I assume most of you have seen autism in your lives, so I think it's okay. So this is just a reminder that the prevalence of autism has been rising for many years. Next slide. So it's the most recent data is 1 in 54, and there are some prevalence estimates that are as high as 1 in 40. So that is really quite prevalent. It's estimated that 4 to 5 million Americans are autistic. So that is a lot of people. Next slide. And autism, although it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, there are a number of comorbid conditions that are very prevalent. Adults and young children, autistic children, tend to have increased risk of gastrointestinal disease, depression, anxiety, seizure disorder, sleep, and the list goes on, but those are just some of the more common things. Next slide. So the treatment of autism is a huge, I'd have to come and give like 20 talks to really encompass all the treatment that exists. But what I'm going to focus on in this talk is less the specific treatments and more of where they happen and where they come from and who's involved, because that's really where the overlap with structural racism comes into play. But the three primary places kids receive treatment is at the school or the sort of state funded systems, in the medical system, and within the home and within the family system. Next slide. So that's kind of my whole overview of autism. So if anyone feels like they don't know autism, feel free to put a question in the chat, because that's kind of all I'm going to talk about with the disorder itself. And now I'm going to move on to talking about early diagnosis and why it's so important, and then how structural racism comes into play and what we can do about it. So there have now been a number of studies, and I'm going to show, I think, just two, because again, I don't have time to show all of them, but a number of studies that show that kids who are diagnosed earlier have better outcomes. So this is one of my collaborators, Karen Pierce's work that I believe was actually published in Nature, where she looked at kids who started autism treatment before 24 months and after 24 months. And she's really obsessed with data visualization, so she had to show it multiple different ways. But what she found is that after adjusting for all other factors, children who started treatment before 24 months had substantially better outcomes on a number of measures, actually, than kids who started treatment later. So the point being that earlier diagnosis and treatment leads to better outcomes for these kids. Next slide. This is just another study. Again, as I said, there are a lot of studies that have looked at this, and I'm just going to show a few, but these are different kids, different measure outcomes, so different tools to look at outcomes. And similarly, they found that the group of kids who were diagnosed earlier, the dark bars, showed significantly more improvement on multiple measures, actually, compared to kids who were diagnosed after 2.5 years. So again, just more evidence that kids who are diagnosed earlier and start treatment seem to make substantial gains at that younger age and go on to have better developmental trajectories. Next slide. The problem is we as a country are pretty bad at diagnosing kids early. So while we know it really improves outcomes, we don't do a good job. This is the most recent CDC data. The CDC tracks, I think every 5 years, they track sort of the state of autism in the United States. And in the most recent data that they published in 2021, they found that although kids can reliably be diagnosed under the age of 3, fewer than half, so only 42% of kids were actually diagnosed at that young age. And as you can see, 39% of kids were actually diagnosed after 4. So that's a huge number of children who are missing the opportunity to get early treatment and improve outcomes. Next slide. And again, I want to talk a little bit about how race, ethnicity, income, and other social determinants of health, and then how structural racism plays into that, overlaps with this issue. So again, as you can see, this is the CDC data showing that the prevalence of autism has been rising over the years. Next slide. But unfortunately, there are substantial differences by race, ethnicity. So as I mentioned before, 39% of kids are diagnosed after the age of 4 years. Well, that is substantially skewed toward racial and ethnic minorities. So it is interesting to note in this slide that if you look on the left, you see these major differences. And as you follow the lines to the right, by 2018, actually, non-Hispanic whites are actually still significantly lower prevalence, but the other racial and ethnic minorities are actually starting to catch up, which is a good thing. But what this indicates is, in my mind at least, is not a difference in true prevalence, but a difference in identification. So I think when these data started to come out, interestingly, there was discussion and conversation about whether there was a true difference in prevalence for autism across race and ethnicity. I don't think that makes a lot of sense, and I don't think there's any data to support that hypothesis. And I think more and more people are realizing that it's not that there is a difference in prevalence by race, but that there's a difference in identification by race or ethnicity. Next slide. So these are the most recent data. This is from the National Survey of Children with Special Needs, or the National Survey of Children's Health. Sorry, they changed the name. And again, as you can see from these numbers, the age of diagnosis is actually starting to equalize across some groups, although particularly Hispanic children are still getting diagnosed much later. While there's been some improvement, there's still a long way to go. Next slide. The other thing that's really interesting is that there are really profound differences in prevalence by geography. So this is, again, this from the CDC data, and you can see that the prevalence is like triple in California as it is in Wisconsin. And again, people debate this. I personally think this is not a true prevalence difference, but what people might call a diagnostic ascertainment or identification difference. So for some reason, California is better at identifying kids and diagnosing them than Wisconsin. I don't think it's a true prevalence. I think there are people who hypothesize there may be some environmental factors that are contributing to this. I don't think it's impossible, but I haven't seen any data to be convinced of that. And then there may be this argument I find a little more convincing, that people are actually moving to the places where they can get better services, which may be influencing prevalence. So it's not as though California has a higher prevalence of kids born in California with autism necessarily, but that once you receive a diagnosis, you move. And actually, interestingly, I was once in a Uber on the way to the airport in Massachusetts, and the woman asked me what I was doing, and I said, "Oh, I'm going to an autism conference." And she said, "Oh, that's interesting. I just moved here from Florida with my family because my daughter is autistic and we needed better services." So that's an N-of-1 study that I found to be a sort of interesting happenstance for that theory. Next slide. So as I was saying, like, what is going on here that we're seeing all these differences in prevalence by race, by ethnicity, by language, by geography? Next slide. So I think there are a number of factors, but what I'm going to talk about is the role of structural racism. So this is the social ecological model, which I think is a nice frame to think about how these different factors or these different structures interact. I sort of changed it from the left, which is the original model, to the right, because I think it's not just, embedded circles, but it's actually, there's a lot of complicated interactions going on between all these structures that are leading to delays in care. Next slide. So I just want to remind us of our definition of structural racism, especially this mutually reinforcing systems as we move forward. Next slide. So I'm going to particularly focus on 3 systems. The medical system, the family system, and state systems. Are obviously significantly more systems that families interact with and these kids interact with. But these are the 3 that I'm going to talk about and how they lead to diagnostic delay and how we can address it. Next slide. So as I mentioned, there are a number of systems that autism diagnosis before age 3 is really critical. These kids do better. You can move forward, sorry. Yeah. So we actually did a study to quantify this. So this is a methodology that we sort of borrowed from the business world, which is a process map with swim lanes. And we wanted to look at how complicated is it actually to get an autism diagnosis. So we actually found that there are 66 steps across 3 to 4 different systems that people have to traverse to obtain a diagnosis for autism. So as a reminder, if we think about all these different systems and all these different steps potentially having reinforcing properties, this is going to become very challenging for any individual or family who experiences structural racism. Next slide. So keep going, sorry. So first I'm going to talk about the medical system. So we know there's been actually a lot of research on physician ability to identify autism and how it really differs by both race and ethnicity. So this is a study by one of my collaborators, Katie Zuckerman, who surveyed families to ask, or surveyed primary care providers to ask them how easy or difficult they thought it was to identify autism in their population. And as you can see, you can advance. Yeah, the primary care pediatricians reported that it was somewhat or very difficult to identify Latino Spanish-speaking children, and they said it was, you know, twice as difficult as non-Latino Spanish families. So we can already see that why some of those Latino or Spanish-speaking families might get identified later, because primary care pediatricians are telling us that they think this is twice as challenging. Next slide. We also know that most primary care doctors don't screen in Spanish. So again, if you have Spanish-speaking families and you're trying to identify autism, you can see there are significant differences between those who screen in English. You can also see that not even half of the pediatricians report screening at all. So that's a problem in and of itself, but that's a little, anyways, it's a little different topic. But with that said, you can see, so they're reporting that it's harder to identify these kids when they speak Spanish. They're reporting that they're not screening in Spanish. Next slide. And then this was a really interesting study by David Mandel and his team in Philadelphia, where they actually found that, so not only are Spanish-speaking families having more difficulty being identified, but this was among Black or African-American families. And he found that many providers were actually giving alternative diagnoses. So he found that Black families were much more likely to get a diagnosis of like conduct disorder or adjustment disorder prior to the autism diagnosis, whereas white families were more likely to go straight for the autism diagnosis. And again, as we talked about, this matters because if you get a conduct disorder diagnosis and then that leads to a two-year delay to your autism diagnosis, then that's 2 years that you did not receive any treatment. So another reason that we might be seeing delays. Next slide. And then again, as I talked about briefly, like this has led to differences in prevalence that we think are likely due to some of these structural racism issues. Next slide. So I talked about the primary care provider and the diagnostician issues that have come up. I'm going to talk a little bit about the family level issues or the family systems. So this is just a quote that I think really exemplifies how challenging it is for families to go through this diagnostic process. So in case it wasn't clear from the process map that I showed, you know, the process of getting a diagnosis can often take months to years between all the appointments that you need, and that can be very stressful for families. Next slide. But it's not only just stressful. We actually know, again, that by race and ethnicity, that there are differences in what families know about autism, potentially leading to differences in their ability to sort of navigate the system. So this specifically is another study by Katie Zuckerman, who found that particularly Latino Spanish-speaking families reported significantly less knowledge about autism, and were much more likely to say that they had never heard of it or that they didn't know much about it. Again, the concern being that the family system is then not, well prepared to reverse this complicated process of obtaining a diagnosis if their knowledge level is low. Next slide. So this was also a really interesting study by my colleague, Ghazi Azad, who also found not only are parents saying, sorry, the slide got cut off, that they don't know as much, but they actually, we see differences by race and ethnicity about what parents are reporting their concerns about their child's development. Next slide. So interestingly in this study, and again, I don't have time to go into it in too much depth, but parents reported, Latino parents reported fewer symptoms of autism in the parent report, and clinicians actually detected more symptoms of autism in their observation. So not only did parents report fewer symptoms, but the clinicians were actually seeing the opposite. Again, suggesting that the family system may not be as well prepared. Next slide. And then this is actually a study that we just published that was a little surprising to us. But we found that this was again, as I mentioned, the diagnostic process is long. So these are kids our families about a year period where we looked at parenting stress as they were traversing this diagnostic process. And we actually found that Hispanic identified families had significantly less stress throughout the entire process. We don't know why, although my hypothesis is that some of the knowledge differences led to this. So if a parent is less worried about their child having autism, then the process itself may feel less stressful. But I think it deserves a lot more digging into. Next slide. So that's all I'm going to talk about with the parent or the family system. And now I'm just going to talk about state systems and then solutions. So most people have probably heard about redlining, but it was historically an attempt for the US government to segregate neighborhoods. And I think recently people have really tried to start looking at this more and more as how it's impacted health. So next slide. So we actually did a study. This was just a small study where we looked at kids, 72 kids who had been, who were referred for autism diagnosis. Again, this traversing this diagnostic odyssey. And we wanted to know what was leading to kids getting a late versus early in this population. And interestingly, the only two factors that we found were kids who had received primary care at multiple health centers and kids who had missed their primary care appointments. So again, the received primary care at multiple health centers, the odds ratio is really big there. But what we, I think what's notable is that a lot of kids who receive primary care at multiple health centers are kids who are kind of moving around quite a bit. And in this population was most frequently due to poverty-related issues, which again is very indicative of sort of where you live is impacting whether you're getting an early versus late autism diagnosis. Next slide. This is a, next slide we can. So this is a really interesting study that I think requires a lot more investigation, but I just wanted to bring it to people's attention. So Maggie Price actually looked at the effectiveness of interventions by geography. And she found that if you live somewhere where there's higher levels of racism, that the psychotherapy intervention actually worked not as well. So this is, I just want to bring this up because it relates to some of the things we're looking at with autism interventions. So this is the only study I know of that has looked at this. I think it's a really interesting and important question that I'm hoping more and more people are going to start thinking about, because it's a really sort of sophisticated way to think about how context impacts effectiveness. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of heterogeneity by state and prevalence, but there's also a lot of heterogeneity in how states address autism. So this is just, we have a study that I'm going to talk about later, but it's across 5 states, which is why I'm showing these 5 states here. But I think the point I just want to make is that in each of these states, there are substantial differences in how insurance covers autism treatments, which can lead to very different sort of contextual milieu of treatment when you're getting treatment. Next slide. Next slide. Sorry, I can skip that. So this is actually another study that was by David Mandel and his team, and they wanted to look at, again, disparities. This was for outpatient treatment service use, so it's not for diagnosis specifically. But what I thought was really interesting is they looked at, they found that there was major disparities in outpatient service use among Black, Asian, and Native American Pacific Islanders. But what I think is most interesting, next slide, is when they adjusted for everything else, that the largest predictor of this variability was actually where you lived. So once they looked at how far you were from a major urban autism center, a lot of the other disparities actually kind of disappeared, and it was really just about where you lived. So again, I think that reiterates this issue about context and where you live as being a major factor that influences your ability to get treatment in this study, but I wouldn't be surprised if we find something similar around diagnosis. Next slide. So this is just a little summary of what I've gone over so far. So I've talked about how there's structural racism can interacting systems can really exacerbate it. And each of these systems that I've talked about, the parents, the state, and the provider level, all seem to be embedded with challenges for these families that are likely interacting with each other and causing problems, leading to delays in diagnosis and unfortunately worse long-term outcomes. Next slide. So I don't want to spend the whole time talking about the bad things. I want to talk about what can we actually do about this. If we have all these different systems that are sort of stacked against minoritized families, how can we address that to level the playing field? So next slide. I'm going to talk about 4 studies specifically that my team is conducting to try to impact this on multiple levels. So first I'm going to talk about a national study that we did looking at barriers to implement early autism diagnosis across 9 states. And then I'm going to talk about a study that we're working on to better understand state policy and how it impacts autism diagnosis. I'm going to talk about a study where we're comparing attempts at improving early autism diagnosis across a number of states. And then I'm going to actually talk about a randomized trial of an early treatment that is designed to impact this problem. So next slide. So this is something called the ASD PEDS network. It was a NIMH funded initiative to test the development of interventions that coordinate autism screening, evaluation, and treatment in the first 2 years of life. So this was a large initiative by NIH. They funded 4 R01 studies and a number of actually smaller sort of spin-off studies that brought people together from across the country to try to address this issue. Next slide. So this was, this is the network and the folks involved in the network. It was founded in 2014. And as you can see, there were a number of sites across the country all looking to address this issue. Next slide. So my role in this team was actually to try to understand implementation and whether there were barriers or facilitators across all these different sites that allowed for successful implementation of these innovations. So in this study, interestingly, one of the major themes that came out was the challenge of going from one system to another, and the challenge of working within the primary care setting. So universally, people found primary care very resistant to wanting to make these changes to improve early autism diagnosis. So that was an important barrier. And then the second was all these folks were trying to do these across multiple states, and they found it very challenging because each state had such a unique context that something that would work in California, for example, they found really didn't seem like it was going to work in Washington State. And they had no idea how to overcome that challenge. Next slide. So what we decided to do in a follow-up study is actually try to better understand that. So this is something called Exploring the Impact of State Policy on Early Autism Diagnosis, the Autism State Policy Index. So what my team is actually trying to do is develop an index that allows us to quantify the strengths and barriers in each state, so that as we think about trying to expand innovations to new states, we can understand the context before we go in and plan accordingly. So this is, I got this idea from a colleague of mine at BU who had done something similar with alcohol. So he looked at all 50 states and what policies existed at the state level around alcohol, and found that there were a lot of correlations between DUIs, binge drinking, and also the ability to implement strategies to decrease alcohol-related sort of problems within the state. So we are now trying to do the same thing with autism to create this index that will allow us to do that. Next slide. So we're still in the early stages of this study, so I don't have too much to share, but I will say that the first part of the study was to interview 50 people across the 5 states that we're focused on for this study specifically, to better understand what are the things that are really creating challenges and what are similar and what are different across states. And these are some of the themes that we're going to include when we develop this policy index. So as you can see, some of the themes that have started to emerge, early intervention, or EI Part C, how that is run is a big issue. Urbanicity, so how many urban centers does your state have, and how many major autism centers do you have in those? Community level stigma, statewide trainings for autism related issues, state autism commissions, similarly, like at the state level, how many resources and how much effort is being put toward this, the cultural capacity of the state, and then specifically, are there any trainings in the primary care, at the primary care level? So that is the first study, and it's ongoing, and it's one attempt to try to address some of these structural problems. Next slide. So the next study is more of a cohort study where we're trying to understand the impact of early diagnosis on longer term outcomes across 5 states. So again, we're trying to understand if we do implement these early diagnostic protocols, how do they differ across states? So this is a collaboration, NIH-funded collaboration between our team and Karen Pierce, who's a psychologist in San Diego. And it's being run in San Diego, Arizona, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. Next slide. So just briefly go through. So Karen tested something called the GetSet model, which was more of a primary care pediatrician training and monitoring system to improve early autism diagnosis. Next slide. And then on the East Coast team, we actually tested something called family navigation, which is a community health worker intervention to improve early diagnosis. Next slide. But these 2 studies, although they were testing different interventions, they had similar goals and outcomes, which was to improve early autism diagnosis and treatment. Next slide. Next. Advance. You can just advance. Sorry. So the goal of this study is to look at these kids who went through these early diagnostic protocols and call them back in when they're older, so about 8 to 10 years old, to look at whether or not they in fact achieve better outcomes. But of interest to this talk is specifically how those outcomes might vary by state, because as we recall, I mentioned the study that found that if you live in an area with increased anti-Black racism, the intervention may not work as well. So we don't have measures of racism specifically, but what we're hoping to do is once we develop our policy index, we're going to be able to look at whether or not the state that you were diagnosed in is a more autism friendly state, and then whether or not your outcomes were actually better, or sort of if that can predict whether or not your outcomes were improved. Next slide. You can keep going. Yeah, sorry. So again, I think I can just kind of breeze through this because I want to make sure we have time for questions. So these are just the aims of the study. Next slide. So I think what's kind of interesting is actually even from baseline, we already see, so these are baseline data from the kids from the study. We already see that there are differences in the kids who are diagnosed in the West Coast, so California and Arizona, versus the East Coast, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. Again, we don't really understand why those differences occur, but that's part of what we're trying to understand. And then in this follow-up study, we're actually going to be able to see if the differences persist over time. I think you can advance. Thanks. Okay, so that was study number 3. I know I'm racing through here. This is like 10 million hours of work in 5 minutes. So this is the final study I'm going to talk about. So far I've talked about sort of at the state level, trying to understand how state policy overlaps with early autism diagnosis. We talked about how context, less at the state level and more at the clinic level, at the primary care provider level, impacts autism diagnosis. And then we just talked about, again, sort of looking at whether state context impacts not only not just autism diagnosis, but outcomes over time. So, and this is the final study I'm going to talk about, which is we're sort of this is the where we're trying to really intervene and see if we can make a difference. So this is a randomized controlled trial of something called reciprocal imitation training. Again, this is an NIMH funded collaborative R01 across all these different sites. And what we are trying to do here is basically, because we know there are so many delays in diagnosis, we're trying to go out into the community and find kids who are showing early signs of autism and actually enrolling them in treatment. So this is a treatment called reciprocal imitation training, which I will try to show a video of shortly, although I'm not sure it's going to work, but it was developed by Brooke Ingersoll in Michigan and her team. And it's an intervention that actually can be used when kids show initial signs of autism and before they actually receive a diagnosis. So you could imagine this could be actually a really important tool as we try to overcome some of these structural issues that are leading to delays. If we're successful here, we can say like, well, as we work on those structural issues and trying to overcome them, we actually have an intervention that we can engage these kids in right away, so that even if they're experiencing delays based on where they live or based on race, ethnicity, we're just going to say, well, fine, let them be delayed for now. We're just going to engage them in treatment right away. So that's kind of the philosophy of this study as an attempt to intervene early in the community. Next slide. So do you want to try the hyperlink? I was just going to show a little bit about what the treatment is. But if it doesn't work, it's fine. We can just keep going.
It's saying I don't have access.
Okay, that's fine. Keep going. So reciprocal imitation, or RIT, it's called an NDBI, which means it's a naturalistic intervention. So it is a form of ABA, which can be controversial. I'm happy to talk about that as well if people want, but it was designed specifically to be an intervention that you use in the child's natural environment. So the video shows a parent and their child at home in the playroom and how, they're using their own play toys to encourage speech and to help teach play skills, et cetera. So that's how the intervention works. This intervention specifically is implemented by early intervention providers who are out in the community. That was really important. Many autism studies have been conducted at urban research centers. And as I mentioned previously, how close you live to an urban research center actually is a strong predictor of your access to services. So we did not want to exacerbate disparities by making this available at academic centers, which is why we're out in the community. And it specifically focuses on social communication. So again, these kids have not been diagnosed as autistic. These are kids who have social communication delay, but many of them will go on to receive an autism diagnosis once they can make it through the system and get their diagnosis. Next slide. So these are just the aims of the study: testing the effectiveness of RIT, trying to understand the mechanisms, and then again, looking at differences by state. As I mentioned before, this is a big question for us. So the study is being conducted across 4 states, and it will allow us to, both pool data to understand effectiveness, but potentially look at whether or not the state systems is impacting differences. Next slide. This is just a conceptual model of the intervention itself. And then again, I just want to reiterate, clearly this is something that's very exciting to me is, sorry, it's kind of, I think the slide format might have gotten a little messed up in the email shuffle, but these kids are enrolling at very young ages before they receive a diagnosis. So they're all receiving many hours of treatment before they actually go in for diagnostic assessment. And again, that's deliberate as an attempt to overcome some of these issues of structural racism and other things as well that are impacting diagnostic delay. Next slide. So again, this is, we're enrolling 120 providers and 440 families. The other thing that I'm happy about is all the families, even the control families, will get access to the intervention. Once they complete the study, they can then enroll if they want to. Next slide. So that's basically all I wanted to talk about because I want to make sure we have time for questions. But just in summary, you know, there are a number of structures that or systems that families and autistic children need to interact with to obtain a diagnosis and get treatment. And structural racism can lead to challenges in each of those settings, leading to disparities in diagnosis, delays in treatment, and unfortunately, negative long-term outcomes. And I hope I was able to convince you a little bit that the research that we're doing is really trying to think about how can we come up with structural solutions to overcome these structural problems. And I gave a few examples. There are a lot more out there, but I wanted to highlight my own work, so I showed those. And next slide. Those are my kids playing hockey. And I have a lot of folks to thank, and apologies to anyone I left off the list, but I want to just, you know, none of this would be possible without all my colleagues and mentors. So that's perfect timing. I have 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Sarabeth. That's an amazing presentation, a lot, very thought-provoking, brings up a lot of issues. So there are several questions already, so I'll just read out the questions if that works from the chat, and people can continue to put in questions in the chat. So Dr. Kuziak asks, for the pediatricians, the primary care pediatrician survey study you mentioned, what were the races of the pediatricians who answered the survey?
Yeah, it's a really good question. They're mostly white and mostly English speaking. I'm very excited about a grant that we just received from NIH to try to increase diversity of the autism workforce because it's a huge problem. But you know, it's a small grant, so we're not going to accomplish that much yet, but it's on the radar because I do think that, you know, I haven't seen it in autism, but in other fields, there have been a number of studies that have showed that if you have like racial or cultural concordance between the family and the provider, that actually leads to better outcomes. The problem is the autism field right now is very white and very English speaking for sure. And it's going to take a lot of work to change that, but hopefully we can start thinking about that or doing something about that.
Thanks. Dr. Rothschild just makes a comment, and feel free to comment on it, but just to, noting the analogy in the disparities in diagnosis in diagnostic entities in the by race being analogous to African Americans being more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia rather than a mood disorder.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, that's exactly, I think, what's going on here.
Yeah. And Dr. Banerjee, one of our PGY1 residents, asked, do you think the family structure in many Hispanic households is protective in terms of response to stress as a result of autism behavioral disruptions?
That's a great question. I don't know. I think it's very possible. I haven't seen a study that necessarily explored that exactly. I do have a grant under review right now where we propose to look at families who like did really well through the diagnostic process, like the low stress families and then the high stress families, and try to do interviews with them to try to understand like what's going on that's creating some families like having this being very stressful and some not. But you know, it's NIH, so that study will get done in like 7 years. So in the meantime, yeah, I don't know. I think it's very possible. I think it's a great question, but one of my favorite studies out there is titled Grandma Knows Best. And they actually looked in Hispanic families. They found that the person who was most sort of understood or likely to report the child having autism symptoms was the grandmother in Hispanic families. So I don't know exactly what it means, but I think it's a really interesting question about sort of the family dynamic and the protective structure. Yeah.
And Dr. Padilla asks, in the data you presented about the racial and ethnicity disparities, was there a difference in preschool enrollment for Latinx children?
I don't know. I don't think it was reported in the study, and I don't know if they collected that information, but also a very good question, because I think we have actually been advocating. So right now, the standard of care is that primary care pediatricians are supposed to screen for autism at 18 and 24 months. And we've been advocating that they need to screen during the preschool years as well, because kids who are identified, if there's differences in preschool enrollment by race and ethnicity, then kids, or if there's, differences in preschool teachers' ability or willingness to identify developmental issues across race or ethnicity, then these disparities are going to get bigger and bigger. So I don't think we know that, but I think it's a really good question.
Next question, with telehealth becoming more common, do you think it might cut through some of the geographical barriers that lead to delays in diagnosis? I'm sure in-person care is much preferred and needed for long-term care, but would telehealth suffice for diagnostic purposes? That's
our hope. David and I are actually working on some initiatives around that. I hope, I'm cautiously optimistic that that telehealth may be one of multiple solutions, but it may contribute to some improvement in care in this space. So yes, is my answer.
Great. Question, are you able to share the hyperlinks to the videos that you referenced?
So one of them is definitely yes. The other is actually like an internal video from our study team. And I know the family signed a waiver that we can show it, but I can't remember if they signed a waiver that we can share it. So one of them definitely yes, the other one I'll have to double check, and then if yes, I'll send them.
Great, thank you. And then because you mentioned it, someone asked, would you please talk about your thoughts or opinions on ABA?
So I will give like a 3,000-foot overview, and then if anyone wants to email me, I'm always more than welcome, happy to talk more about it. My opinion is that there are multiple treatments that fall under the ABA umbrella, and that's a problem because traditional ABA is problematic in my mind. And like some of the newer things that technically are considered ABA, like so what some people call NDBI, which is naturalistic treatment, technically fall under the ABA umbrella, but I don't actually think they're really ABA, and I feel that they're very positive. If anyone has friends at PCORI, we have a grant under review to compare sort of the traditional ABA style treatment that many people don't like because it uses sort of punishment or sort of an iteration of punishment versus the more modern naturalistic play-based therapy. Our hope is that we can actually definitively show in this comparative effectiveness study that the new, like more naturalistic interventions are better. So that's my sort of bigger picture view, but I'm more than happy to engage further if anyone wants to talk about it. It's a very fraught topic. I think many people have suffered at the hands of ABA, so I want to make sure that I recognize that challenge, but also think about how we can, make sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, I guess.
Emily, this is Amy Weinstock. Can I just say there's also there's been rapid expansion of ABA because of access to insurance, and there's very varying levels of quality. So there's unfortunately a lot of what I would say is bad ABA out there, whatever the modality and methodology they're using, and that people just need to be really careful.
Yeah, that's such a good, thank you, Amy. Yeah, a lot of people who say they don't like ABA, some of them at least have been exposed to bad ABA. So again, a whole nother field that I have a bunch of work in is how do we measure and monitor fidelity to ABA out in the community? because it's another huge problem that also probably has a lot of overlap with structural racism. So if you want me to come back next year and talk about that.
And Sue Swanson just comments that, you know, whatever intervention should be developmentally informed, which is oftentimes, sometimes missed in the delivery. And we have one last question. I think we have time for 1 minute. Since we changed DSM diagnostic criteria from DSM-4 to 5, have you seen any difference in terms of stigma, early diagnosis, and access to treatment?
Yeah, I love that question because when the DSM changed, people were freaking out about it, and now I never hear people talk about it anymore. I haven't seen anything with my own eyes, I can say. Which surprises me. I think we definitely were worried we were gonna see a lot of changes, but yeah, I can't say that I have. I'm sure someone out there is actually looking at this rigorously, and I haven't looked at the data, so I can only say what my personal experience is. I haven't seen much.
Yeah. I think that is all the questions we have, and we're right at the hour. So.
Awesome. Well, thanks for inviting me. This was great. I appreciate it.
Very much. That was excellent.
All right. Thank you.